repressed memory makes you shut down every time you think of it? My friend Angeline called slurring that she was too hungover to work her overnight shift at the women's shelter and begged me to cover. She said it was mostly just keeping an eye on things. I got to the shelter at 11 and realized I was completely alone. The shelter was small, only 12 beds, and everyone was already asleep since lights out was at 10. I sat at the front desk trying to figure out the ancient computer system when someone knocked on the locked door asking for tampons, which took me 20 minutes to find in the supply closet. Then the smoke alarm went off because someone was secretly smoking in the bathroom, and I had to reset it while my hands shook, terrified everyone would wake up and I'd have no idea how to handle them. Around 1 a.m., I was finally feeling calmer when someone started crying in their room, and I had to figure out whether to intervene or let them be. By 2 a.m., the building was dead quiet, and I was exhausted, reading through Angeline's notes about medications and special protocols, when the front door buzzer went off. On the security camera, I saw a woman hunched over, pressing the buzzer repeatedly, and when I opened the door, she practically fell inside. Sophie couldn't have been older than 25, wearing a restaurant uniform with a name tag, and she was pressing both hands against her stomach where dark blood was spreading across her white shirt. She looked up at me with huge, terrified eyes and said, "He found me at work. I need help." I caught her as her legs gave out and lowered her to the floor, seeing 3 separate stab wounds in her abdomen, blood pooling fast on the floor. I called 911 with shaking fingers, putting them on speaker while I ran for towels, and the dispatcher said the ambulance was 20 minutes out because of a multi-car accident downtown. Sophie was crying and holding my hand so tight while I pressed towels against her wounds, the blood soaking through immediately, and I realized I had absolutely no idea what I was doing. She kept saying, "I have a daughter. She's 2. Her name is Lily. Please don't let me die." I told her she'd be okay while applying pressure, but there was so much blood and I could feel it warm and sticky on my hands, and I'd never seen this much blood in my life. I didn't know if I should elevate her legs or keep her flat, if I should remove the towels when they soaked through or keep adding more on top, if I was pressing too hard or not hard enough. Sophie was getting paler by the second, and her grip on my hand was weakening, and I was completely alone with no one to help or tell me what to do. She whispered that her ex had found out where she worked, even though she'd changed jobs 3 times and he'd waited in the parking lot with a knife. I kept pressure on the worst wound, but blood was literally pooling around us and my hands kept slipping and I didn't know if I was making it worse. Sophie started shaking and said she was cold, and I remembered from some TV show that was bad, but I didn't know what to do about it. I grabbed a blanket from the desk with one bloody hand while keeping pressure with the other, trying to cover her while she whispered about Lily. She said Lily loved dolphins and they were going to the aquarium for her birthday next week, and I kept talking to her about dolphins even though I knew nothing about them, just making stuff up to keep her conscious. The dispatcher kept saying 15 more minutes, then 12, then 10, and Sophie's lips were turning blue. She made me promise to tell Lily she loved her, and I kept saying she'd tell her herself, but my voice was cracking because I could see her dying and I didn't know how to stop it. Blood had soaked through 8 towels and was spreading across the floor, and my knees were wet with it and my arms were burning from pressing down. Sophie's eyes started rolling back and I tapped her face, begging her to stay awake, but she wasn't responding to my voice anymore. Her breathing became these tiny gasps with long pauses between them, and I didn't know if I should do CPR, but she still had a pulse, weak and thready under my fingers. The dispatcher was saying something about checking her airway, but I couldn't leave the wounds and there was no one else here. All the residents were asleep, and I was terrified to scream for help, because what if no one knew what to do either? Sophie's hand went completely limp in mine, and her breathing stopped for 10 seconds, then a tiny gasp, then nothing for 15 seconds. I was sobbing now, pressing on her wounds and begging her to breathe, to think about Lily at the aquarium, but her face was gray like paper. I could hear sirens finally, but they still sounded far away, and Sophie hadn't taken a breath in 30 seconds. I started chest compressions, even though I knew it would make the bleeding worse, but she wasn't breathing at all, and I remembered you were supposed to do 30 compressions then 2 breaths, but there was so much blood I was slipping and losing count. My hands were sliding in the blood with each compression, and I could feel ribs cracking and I was screaming, "Sophie! Sophie!" But she was completely unresponsive. The door crashed open and 2 paramedics rushed in with a stretcher and bags of equipment. One dropped to his knees beside Sophie and checked for a pulse while the other pulled out an oxygen mask. They cut away her shirt with scissors, and I saw the wounds were even worse than I thought. The first paramedic started an IV in her arm, while the second one packed gauze into the wounds. They worked fast, not talking except to call out numbers about blood pressure and heart rate. One of them started CPR while the other prepared a bag of fluids that he hung from a pole. They loaded her onto the stretcher and one kept doing compressions as they wheeled her out. I followed them to the door and watched the ambulance speed away with lights flashing and sirens screaming. My whole body shook as I stood there in the doorway covered in blood. The shelter was quiet again, and I realized I was alone with 12 sleeping residents. I locked the front door with shaking hands and checked that all the windows were secure. The blood on the floor looked black under the dim overhead lights. It had spread across half the entrance area and was starting to dry at the edges. I grabbed a roll of paper towels from the desk and got on my knees to start cleaning. The towels just smeared the blood around and turned to red mush in my hands. I went to the supply closet and found a bucket and mop, but the blood had soaked into the floor. After 20 minutes of scrubbing, I gave up because my arms were too tired to keep going. I pulled out my phone and called Fernanda Reed even though it was 3 in the morning. She answered on the second ring sounding wide awake, I tried to explain what happened, but the words came out all jumbled and wrong. She said she was coming right away and told me to sit at the desk and just breathe. I went to the bathroom and turned on the hot water to wash my hands. The blood had dried under my fingernails and wouldn't come out no matter how hard I scrubbed. I used soap and a nail brush, but it was stuck in the creases of my skin. My shirt was soaked with blood that had turned stiff and brown. I sat back at the desk and watched the clock move from 3:30 to 4 to 4:30. Every little sound made me jump, like maybe Sophie's ex had come back. A resident coughed in their sleep and I almost screamed. At 5:30, I heard someone get up to use the bathroom and I tried to look normal. By 6 o'clock, more residents were waking up and moving around their rooms. They came out to get coffee from the kitchen and I pretended everything was fine. One woman asked why there were police lights outside earlier and I said it was nothing important. My clothes were covered in blood, but I pulled my jacket closed to hide it. Fernanda arrived at 7 looking perfect in a business suit even though it was so early. She took one look at me and sent me straight to the staff room. I could hear her on the phone making calls and talking in a calm, professional voice. A police officer showed up about 20 minutes later with a notebook and pen. He asked me to tell him everything that happened from the beginning. I explained about Sophie showing up stabbed and bleeding and what she said about her ex. He wrote it all down without showing any reaction on his face. He asked if I knew the ex's name or what he looked like, and I didn't. After he left, Fernanda came into the staff room and sat down across from me. She said Sophie was in surgery and it was critical, but she was still alive. The relief hit me so hard that I started crying for the first time since it happened. Fernanda handed me tissues and said I did everything I could to help. I pulled out my phone and called Angeline's number with shaking fingers. She answered sounding groggy and confused, like she just woke up. I started yelling about how she left me alone with no training and someone almost died. She started crying and saying she was sorry, but I hung up on her. I couldn't deal with her excuses when Sophie might still die. About an hour later, Detective Edgar Robinson showed up wearing a gray suit and tie. He was older with gray hair and kind eyes that made me feel safer. He explained they were trying to find Sophie's ex and needed more details from me. He asked about every single thing I could remember from when Sophie arrived. What was she wearing? Which direction did she come from? What exactly did she say? I told him about the restaurant uniform and her saying he found her at work. He wanted to know about the wounds and how many there were and where. I described the 3 stab wounds in her stomach and all the blood. He asked what Sophie said about her daughter, and I told him about Lily and the dolphins. Edgar wrote everything down and asked me to repeat certain parts to make sure he got it right. He said they would check security cameras from nearby businesses to track where Sophie came from. Fernanda walked into the room then and told Edgar we could finish this later because she'd arranged for someone else to cover the rest of my shift. She handed me my car keys and said I should go to the hospital to check on Sophie. Edgar nodded and said he'd be in touch soon about the formal statement. I stood up and my legs felt like jelly after sitting for so long. The blood on my clothes had dried stiff and brown, and I could smell it with every movement. I walked out to my car in the parking lot and sat there for a minute with my hands on the steering wheel. The sun was coming up and normal people were starting their day while I was covered in someone else's blood. I started the car and drove to the hospital on autopilot, not really seeing the road. The emergency room parking lot was packed and I had to circle 3 times to find a spot. I walked through the sliding doors and the bright lights made me squint. The waiting room was full of people with various injuries and illnesses. I went to the desk and told the woman behind the glass that I was here about Sophie who came in by ambulance. She typed something into her computer and said Sophie was still in surgery and I couldn't see her because I wasn't family. I asked if there was any update and she just shook her head and pointed to the waiting area. I found an empty chair in the corner and sat down. People kept looking at my bloody clothes and moving away from me. About an hour passed with no news and I was starting to fall asleep in the uncomfortable plastic chair when a nurse in green scrubs walked over. She had a name tag that said Maya Ingram and she crouched down next to me. She said she recognized me from when the paramedics brought Sophie in and wanted me to know Sophie was still in surgery. She couldn't give me details but said the surgeons were doing everything they could. I thanked her and she squeezed my shoulder before going back through the double doors. Another hour went by and a woman in a business suit approached me. She introduced herself as Delaney Morse from the Victim Advocacy Center. She said she'd been assigned to Sophie's case and heard I was the one who tried to help her. She sat down next to me and handed me her business card. She said she knew this was traumatic and offered to help me process what I'd witnessed. She explained about counseling services and support groups for people who'd experienced this kind of violence. I took the card, but couldn't really focus on what she was saying. My brain felt fuzzy, and I kept seeing Sophie's face going gray. Delaney stayed with me in the waiting room and brought me a cup of water from the vending machine. 3 more hours passed with people coming and going around us. Finally, Maya came back out through the double doors. Her face told me everything before she even spoke. She sat down on my other side and said Sophie didn't make it. The blood loss was too severe, and she went into cardiac arrest on the operating table. They tried for 40 minutes but couldn't bring her back. I felt like someone punched me in the stomach. All that blood and pressure and begging her to stay awake, and she died anyway. I started crying right there in the waiting room and couldn't stop. Delaney helped me up and walked me to the bathroom. I locked myself in a stall and sobbed until I threw up. I kept thinking about what I could have done differently. Maybe if I'd pressed harder on the wounds or done the chest compressions better or started CPR sooner. Delaney knocked on the stall door and said it wasn't my fault. She said I did everything I could with no training and no help. But Sophie was still dead and Lily didn't have a mom anymore. I came out of the stall and splashed cold water on my face. Edgar was waiting outside the bathroom when we came out. He said they'd identified Sophie's ex from security footage at the restaurant where she worked. They had his name and address but hadn't found him yet. He needed me to come to the station when I was ready to do a formal recorded interview about everything that happened. I said I could come now, but he looked at my bloody clothes and said tomorrow morning would be fine. Fernanda called my phone and said she needed me back at the shelter to do an incident report. I drove back feeling completely numb. Fernanda was waiting in her office with forms spread across her desk. She was kind and kept saying I did an amazing job under impossible circumstances, but I could see the worry in her eyes about liability issues. The shelter wasn't supposed to have untrained people handling medical emergencies. She asked me to write down everything that happened from when Sophie arrived to when the paramedics took her. My hand was shaking, so bad I could barely hold the pen. It took me an hour to write 3 pages about the blood and the wounds, and Sophie talking about Lily. Fernanda made copies and said the shelter's lawyer might need to talk to me. She told me to go home and rest. The next morning, I woke up at 5 and couldn't go back to sleep. I showered but still felt dirty. I put on clean clothes and drove to the police station. Edgar met me in the lobby and took me to a small room with a camera on a tripod. He explained he needed to record my full statement for the investigation. He pressed record and asked me to start from the beginning. I had to go through every detail again. How Sophie looked when she came in, the 3 stab wounds in her stomach, what she said about her ex finding her at work, the blood spreading on the floor, how her hand felt getting weaker in mine, the sound of her ribs cracking when I did compressions. Edgar asked follow-up questions about timing and what exactly Sophie said. The whole thing took 2 hours, and I was exhausted by the end. That afternoon, my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. The woman said she was Camilla Durham from Child Protective Services. She was handling Lily's case and needed to know what Sophie said about her daughter. I told her everything I could remember. How Sophie kept saying Lily was 2 years old. How she loved dolphins and they were going to the aquarium for her birthday. How Sophie made me promise to tell Lily she loved her. Camilla wrote it all down and said it would help them find the right placement for Lily. She said Sophie's family was contacted. After she hung up, I finally went home. I stood in the shower for an hour with the water as hot as I could stand it. I scrubbed my hands until they were raw, but I could still feel the blood. When I got out, my roommate was sitting on my bed. She took one look at my face and knew something awful had happened. She asked what was wrong, but I just shook my head. I couldn't find the words to explain that I'd watched someone die, that I'd tried to save her and failed, that a little girl named Lily would grow up without her mom. I just sat there while my roommate held me, and I cried until I had nothing left. The next morning, Angeline was standing at my door holding a bunch of cheap flowers from the gas station, and her eyes were red and puffy from crying. She pushed past me into my apartment and started talking fast about how sorry she was, and how she knew she'd messed up bad. I sat on my couch while she paced around my living room saying she'd been drinking too much lately, and it was getting worse, and she needed help. She kept trying to hug me, but I couldn't even look at her because all I could think about was being alone with Sophie bleeding out on that floor. Angeline said she was going to start going to meetings and get her life together, but I was too tired to care about her problems when Sophie was dead because she left me alone. She finally left after an hour of apologizing, and I went straight back to bed even though it was only noon. That night, I jerked awake at exactly 2 in the morning with my sheets soaked in sweat, and my heart pounding so hard it hurt. In the nightmare, Sophie's face was gray, like old newspaper, and her blood was everywhere, covering the walls and ceiling and dripping down on me. I couldn't go back to sleep, so I sat in my kitchen drinking coffee and staring at nothing until the sun came up. My phone rang around 8, and it was Fernanda saying the shelter was making big changes because of what happened. She explained they were bringing in people to teach crisis training for all the staff, and nobody would work alone anymore. She wanted me to help make new rules once I felt ready, but the idea of being responsible for anything made my stomach hurt. I told her I needed more time, and she understood, but I could hear the stress in her voice about getting everything fixed fast. Later that afternoon, Edgar called and his voice was different, more excited than usual. He said they found Sophie's ex hiding at his mom's house 2 towns over, and he still had her blood on his clothes and shoes. The guy broke down and told them everything when they showed him the security videos from the restaurant where he'd waited for her. Edgar said with his confession, and all the evidence, it would be a strong case, and Sophie's family would get justice. I hung up feeling empty because justice wouldn't bring Sophie back or give Lily her mom. 2 days later, I forced myself to go to a support group that Delaney had told me about for people who'd seen bad violence. The meeting was in a church basement, and there were 8 other people sitting in a circle on metal chairs. Everyone took turns talking about what they'd witnessed, and how it changed them. And I realized they all had the same look in their eyes that I saw in my mirror. When it was my turn, I could barely get the words out about Sophie and the blood and trying to save her while being completely alone. A woman across from me nodded and said she'd tried to save her neighbor after a shooting, and still had nightmares about the blood too. By the end of the meeting, I felt less crazy knowing other people understood what it was like to have these images stuck in your head. The next week, reporters started calling the shelter non-stop because someone had leaked the story to the news. Fernanda handled all of it and made sure they didn't use my name, but seeing it on TV made everything feel weird and unreal. They showed Sophie's picture from her work badge and talked about domestic violence statistics, while I sat there remembering her actual voice begging me not to let her die. I tried going back to my regular office job the following Monday, but I couldn't focus on spreadsheets and emails when my brain kept replaying that night. My boss pulled me aside after I messed up 3 different reports and asked if everything was okay. When I started crying in her office, she said I should take some time off to deal with whatever was happening, and I practically ran out of the building. That afternoon, Camilla called with an update about Lily, and I could hear papers shuffling in the background. She said they'd found Sophie's sister who lived 3 hours away, and she was happy to take Lily in permanently. Camilla mentioned that Lily kept asking where her mommy was, and wouldn't stop carrying around a stuffed dolphin, which made my chest feel tight. She said the sister seemed really nice and had 2 kids of her own, so Lily would have cousins to play with. After we hung up, I sat at my kitchen table and started writing a letter for Lily to read when she was older. I wrote about how brave her mom was, and how she fought to stay alive because she loved Lily so much. I told her about the dolphins and how her mom's eyes lit up, talking about their birthday trip to the aquarium. I wrote 3 pages about Sophie's strength and love before calling Delaney to ask if she could get it into Lily's file. Delaney promised she'd make sure the letter stayed with Lily's records so she'd have it when she was ready. A week later, Edgar called to say the preliminary hearing was set for next month, and I'd need to testify about what I saw. He explained I'd have to describe finding Sophie and trying to help her, while the defense lawyer would ask me questions too. The thought of being in the same room as Sophie's ex and having to relive everything in front of strangers made me run to the bathroom to throw up. 3 days later, Angeline texted me that she'd checked into an outpatient program after her mom staged an intervention. She sent updates every few days about group sessions and making amends lists and working through why she drank, but I couldn't bring myself to respond yet because I was still too mad about being left alone that night. I started meeting with a therapist the victim services people set up for me. This woman who worked out of a tiny office downtown and specialized in people who'd witnessed violent crimes. She taught me this breathing thing where you count to 4 inhaling and 6 exhaling when the memories hit, and showed me how to press my feet into the floor to ground myself when I started seeing Sophie's blood again. During our 3rd session, I broke down crying about the sound of Sophie's ribs cracking under my hands, and she said that was actually normal for untrained people doing CPR. Meanwhile, Fernanda called a big meeting at the shelter and announced they were changing everything. No more solo overnight shifts ever. Always 2 people minimum with at least 1 trained in first aid. She said the board approved emergency funding for the changes, and looked right at me when she said Sophie's death wouldn't be for nothing, which made my throat close up. The preliminary hearing date came faster than I wanted, and Edgar picked me up at my apartment because I was shaking too bad to drive myself. The courthouse was this old building downtown with metal detectors and cops everywhere, and they put me in a small room to wait until it was my turn. When they called me in, Sophie's ex was sitting at a table in an orange jumpsuit with his lawyer, staring straight at me with these dead eyes while I walked to the witness stand. The prosecutor asked me to describe finding Sophie, and I had to tell the whole thing. The blood spreading on her shirt, the 3 wounds, how she begged me not to let her die. Sophie's ex kept staring, and I focused on the prosecutor's tie to avoid looking at him while I described the compressions and feeling ribs break and Sophie turning gray. The defense lawyer asked if I had medical training, and when I said no, he asked how I could be sure Sophie was really dying and not just injured, which made me want to scream. After 2 hours of questions, the judge called a recess, and I practically ran to the bathroom where Sophie's sister found me splashing water on my face. She grabbed my hands and said thank you for trying to help her sister, that knowing someone was with Sophie at the end meant everything to their family. When we went back in, the judge said there was sufficient evidence for murder charges, and set a trial date for 6 months out. Sophie's whole family was there, her parents and 2 sisters and an aunt, all crying and holding each other while they led Sophie's ex out in chains. 2 weeks later, Fernanda asked if I'd come help with the new emergency training program at the shelter since I had real experience with crisis situations. Walking through that front door again made my whole body tense up, and I could see the spot where Sophie collapsed, even though they'd replaced the carpet. The training instructor was this former EMT who went through proper wound care and pressure points and how to recognize shock. And when she demonstrated on a dummy, I had to leave the room because it brought everything back. She found me outside and said learning what you should have done differently is always hard, but it helps you be ready next time. Though I kept thinking there shouldn't be a next time. During the lunch break, I was sitting in my car when I saw a woman with a small girl walking across the parking lot toward the shelter entrance. The little girl was clutching a stuffed dolphin and wearing a pink dress, and even from far away I knew it was Lily because she had Sophie's same dark hair and the way she walked. Her aunt was carrying a box, probably picking up Sophie's things from storage, and I watched Lily skip ahead swinging her dolphin by the tail. My chest got so tight I couldn't breathe right, and I started the car and left before they could see me, driving home with tears running down my face. That evening, Edgar called to say the defense lawyer was pushing for a plea deal, 20 to life instead of risking trial, and the DA thought it was solid but wanted to check with the family first. He said trials were hard on everyone, and seeing crime scene photos and hearing testimony could traumatize Sophie's family more, but they might want their day in court anyway. A week later, Delaney called about a candlelight vigil for domestic violence victims and asked if I wanted to come, said they'd be reading names including Sophie's. I met her at the courthouse steps where about 200 people had gathered with candles, mostly women but some men and kids too. They started reading names alphabetically, and each one hit like a punch. Maria Gonzalez, age 31, Jennifer Hayes, age 26, Lois Johnson, age 44, and when they got to Sophie June, age 24, my candle was shaking so bad the wax dripped on my hand. People around me were crying too, and this older woman next to me grabbed my hand and squeezed it, and for the first time I felt like Sophie's story mattered to more than just me and her family. 3 weeks after the vigil, Angeline texted me asking if we could meet for coffee because she'd just gotten her 1-month sobriety chip and wanted to talk. I met her at this little place near the park, and she looked different, clearer somehow, like she'd been sleeping for the first time in years. She ordered herbal tea instead of her usual triple shot, and told me about going to meetings every day. how she'd started drinking after her sister died in a car accident 2 years ago and never stopped. She said that night at the shelter was her rock bottom, knowing someone died because she was too drunk to show up, and she'd been working through the 12 steps with a sponsor. She showed me the chip, this small plastic token that meant everything, and said she was sorry. Really sorry. Not just the drunk apologies she'd given before. 2 days later, Fernanda called about a memorial service at the shelter for Sophie, said they were putting up a plaque by the entrance. I drove there early Saturday morning and found about 30 people gathered, Sophie's family and some residents and staff members I'd never met. Fernanda had this bronze plaque installed that said, "In memory of Sophie June, your courage saved lives," and underneath were the dates. She gave a short speech about how Sophie's death led to new safety protocols, mandatory staffing minimums, panic buttons in every room, and partnerships with local hospitals for emergency training. Sophie's mom touched the plaque and cried while her dad held her, and I stood in the back trying not to think about all the blood that used to be right there. The crisis intervention training started the next Monday, 8 weeks of classes every evening at the community college. The instructor was this former paramedic named Rick, who'd worked trauma units for 20 years, and he started by saying most people freeze in emergencies and that's normal. We practiced on dummies, learning proper pressure points, and how to recognize different types of shock, and when compressions would help versus hurt. During the wound care section, Rick demonstrated the exact technique for abdominal wounds, and I realized I'd done it mostly right. Just needed steadier pressure, and should have elevated her legs. On the last day, he pulled me aside and said based on my description of that night, I'd kept Sophie alive long enough to say goodbye, which was more than most untrained people could have done. Edgar called the following week with news about the plea deal, said Sophie's ex had agreed to 25 to life rather than risk trial and the death penalty. The judge would have to approve it, but the DA thought it was solid, especially since he'd confessed, and they had his DNA under Sophie's fingernails where she'd fought back. I wanted him to get life without parole, but Edgar said plea deals meant Sophie's family wouldn't have to see crime scene photos or hear testimony about her final moments, and Lily wouldn't grow up with a trial hanging over her childhood. The sentencing was set for next month, and they'd let me give a victim impact statement if I wanted. A month later, I finally felt ready to take an overnight shift at the shelter again, this time properly trained and with another staff member named Arjun, who'd been doing this for 5 years. I checked all the new panic buttons, tested the direct line to the hospital, made sure the medical supplies were stocked, and still jumped when the door buzzer went off around midnight. It was just someone needing tampons, but my heart was racing, and Arjun noticed, said it took him 6 months after his first crisis to stop flinching at that sound. The shift went smooth. Nobody needed anything serious, but I kept checking the cameras and walking the halls every hour. 3 days after that, Camilla sent me an email with a photo attached and the subject line, "Thought you'd want to see this." I opened it at work and had to close my office door because I started crying immediately. It was Lily at the aquarium for her 3rd birthday, wearing a purple dress with dolphins on it, standing in front of the giant tank with her arms spread wide and the biggest smile. There were dolphin balloons and a dolphin cake on the table behind her, and she was holding that same stuffed dolphin from when I'd seen her at the shelter. Camilla wrote that Lily was doing well with her aunt, starting preschool soon, and they talked about Sophie every day using a memory book they'd made together. My therapist said I was making real progress when I told her about the photo, that I could feel happy for Lily instead of just guilty about Sophie. She'd been working with me on something called survivor's guilt, how I kept replaying that night trying to figure out what I could have done different. The nightmares had gotten better, down to maybe once a week instead of every night, and I'd stopped checking my hands for blood that wasn't there. She taught me this grounding technique for when the flashbacks hit, counting 5 things I could see, 4 I could hear, 3 I could touch, 2 I could smell, 1 I could smell, 1 I could taste. Angeline and I started meeting for coffee every week after her meetings, slowly rebuilding something that felt different from our old friendship. She'd been volunteering at the shelter on weekends, doing intake and organizing donations, trying to give back somehow. She was up to 60 days sober and had started sponsoring another woman, said helping someone else stay sober helped her remember why she quit. We didn't talk about that night much, but when we did, she'd say she was grateful I was there, that Sophie had someone who tried. Fernanda asked if I'd speak at a training seminar for new shelter workers across the state, share my experience about being unprepared for medical emergencies. I stood in front of 40 people in a conference room and told them about the blood and the compressions and not knowing what to do, how the protocols exist because someone like Sophie might come through their door. I showed them pictures of the new emergency supplies and explained why each item mattered, why 2 staff members were essential, why the panic buttons could save lives. After my talk, 3 people came up to say they'd had similar experiences and wished they'd had proper training first. 6 months after Sophie died, Fernanda called me into her office and offered me a full-time position as crisis response coordinator for the shelter. The job meant training staff, updating protocols, coordinating with hospitals and police, and being on call for emergencies. The pay wasn't great, but it came with benefits, and most importantly, it meant no one would face what I did alone and unprepared again. I accepted immediately, knowing this was how I could honor Sophie's memory and make sure Lily's mom didn't die for nothing. The grant money came through 3 months later, and Fernanda had me help pick out the new equipment since I knew what we actually needed during emergencies. We installed panic buttons in every room that connected straight to 911, mounted security cameras that covered every angle of the entrance and common areas, and bought a medical supply cabinet that looked like something from an actual hospital. I spent 2 days organizing all the supplies, labeling everything clearly so anyone could find what they needed fast, putting tourniquets and pressure bandages right at eye level where you'd grab them first. The handbook took me 6 weeks to write because I kept remembering things I wished I'd known that night. I included step-by-step pictures for applying pressure to wounds, a flowchart for when to call 911 versus handling something internally, and phone numbers for every emergency service in huge print on the first page. Fernanda made copies for every shelter in our network, and other directors started calling to thank me for creating something they'd needed for years, but never had time to make. I was sorting donations one afternoon when a pink envelope arrived addressed to me with a return address I didn't recognize. Inside was a card with a child's drawing of dolphins jumping over rainbows in crayon, and a note from Sophie's sister saying Lily was doing great in preschool and loved art class. The drawing went straight onto my office wall where I could see it every day, and for the first time I smiled thinking about Sophie instead of just feeling that crushing weight in my chest. My therapist noticed the change too, said I was finally processing the trauma instead of just reliving it, and we cut our sessions down to twice a month. The nightmares that used to wake me up gasping and checking my hands for blood happened maybe once a month now, and I could drive past the hospital without my heart racing. Angeline hit her 1-year mark in September and invited me to her celebration meeting where she got her coin. She stood up in front of 30 people and talked about how losing Sophie's trust and almost costing someone their life was her rock bottom, how she'd been drinking to deal with her own trauma from working at the shelter. After the meeting, she introduced me to a woman she was sponsoring, someone who reminded me of how broken Angeline looked that first month after Sophie died. We went for coffee every Sunday now. Real coffee, not the awful stuff from meetings, and talked about everything except that night unless one of us needed to. She'd started teaching self-defense classes at the shelter on weekends, showing the residents basic moves that might buy them time to run, and seeing her help other women felt like watching someone rebuild themselves from scratch. I was explaining the emergency protocols to a new overnight worker named Jessica when I saw myself 2 years ago in her wide eyes and shaking hands. She kept asking what-if questions about things going wrong, and I made sure to answer every single one without making her feel stupid for being scared. I showed her the medical supplies 3 times until she could find everything with her eyes closed, walked her through the panic button system, and gave her my personal cell number. On her first solo overnight, I stayed awake at home with my phone next to me just in case she needed to call, remembering how alone I'd felt that night. She texted me at 3 a.m. that everything was quiet, and she felt prepared, and I finally fell asleep knowing she'd never face what I did. The 2-year anniversary vigil happened on a cold March evening, and Fernanda asked if I'd speak this time. I stood at the microphone looking at the crowd holding candles, Sophie's family in the front row, and talked about a brave young woman who loved her daughter more than anything. I told them how Sophie fought to build a safe life for Lily, changing jobs 3 times to stay hidden, how she'd talked about dolphins even while dying because she wanted Lily to have that birthday trip. I explained how Sophie's death led to changes that made our shelter and dozens of others safer, how her story pushed through the grant funding, how the handbook named after her had already helped 3 other shelters handle medical emergencies. Sophie's sister found me after and hugged me tight, showed me a recent photo of Lily at a school play dressed as a dolphin, and said they'd finally made it to the aquarium last month. These days, I could walk past the spot where Sophie died without seeing the blood, could think about her without my throat closing up, could even talk about that night without falling apart. The shelter felt different now with 2 people always on overnight shifts, the medical supplies that everyone knew how to use, and the panic buttons that gave everyone peace of mind. I kept Lily's dolphin drawing above my desk, and sometimes when I was training someone new or updating protocols, I'd look at it and think about how a 2-year-old girl somewhere was growing up safe and loved because her mom was brave enough to ask for help. All right, that's it from me today. Thanks for tagging along while I wondered about all this random stuff. It's been a fun ride, like the video. It helps more than you think.